I want to share with you a few thoughts this morning about the passage that Terry read for us. And, you know, this is Palm Sunday. In the sanctuary, the children are coming in waving palms. There might even be like a donkey coming down the aisle. Not sure. Okay, I'm sure. There's not. The story of Palm Sunday, you know, is one that is often celebrated in this this way. You know, there's something about that story. Jesus riding in to town on a donkey. Nothing particularly fancy about that. For someone who had been seen as such a leader, such an amazing leader, the idea that he would be coming into town on a donkey. John Dominic Crossan suggests in his book, God and Empire, that this is an intentional farce, meant to be seen as a contrast to the Roman authority. You know, if you think about, just kind of imagine Jerusalem, and in one gate, here comes Jesus on a donkey, and at the other end, here comes the Roman battalion with their stallions. The symbol of power and authority and might, in some ways kind of being made fun of at the other end of town. Maybe he and Walter Wink are wrong when they suggest there's a little bit of street theater going on with the people participating. But Jesus probably knew it wasn't going to fly with the authorities. It seems pretty obvious if you look at where things go from that moment, that it goes pretty fast downhill. And the rest of what is celebrated this week as Holy Week, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Easter, are all a part of a story that now we put in context. But I try to imagine what it was like if we read the story and imagine what it must have been like for people there at that time. Here's a guy who has said some things about life that are dramatically different from the culture, a paradigmatic shift. The rules and the laws will be kept, but love is more important than the laws. Love is more important than the laws. Love is more important than the power. Forgiveness and grace and mercy, more important than judgment and justice. Wow. He might as well be riding into town right now. You know, somehow this message must be spoken over and over and over again, it seems like. Somehow, for us to be able to identify with this message that, guess what? You may want justice, and you may want power, and you may want a lot of control, but where will that leave you in the end? Where will that leave you? And more importantly, where will that leave everybody else? What if I am the vine, you are the branches? What if there is this unity that connects all of us? What would it be like to discover at the end of the most powerful life, having won the most judgments, having been without mercy or generosity to so many others, to discover that everything you did simply robbed from yourself? So closely identified you had become that all of what we do we do as a connected group of beings. That everything is a part of this web of relationship. Scientists may be discovering that. But the mystics and the great spiritual teachers have been talking about it for ages and ages. We just kind of have a hard time figuring out what to do with it. Because it sure seems like when someone causes harm, that, retribution is in order. It sure seems like it looks good to have your act together, and often that means having a lot of money. It sure seems like a better way to live, to have the reins of power rather than to be trampled under the feet of those stallions. Maybe it takes some brokenness. Or maybe, as Peter Mayer said in one of his songs, sometimes to reach the highest place you have to fall. You got to fall. You have to somehow lose it. Fritz Perls said, "Lose your mind and come to your senses." Sometimes we have to somehow let go of this indoctrination into power and control and domination to be able to find the heart and rediscover how life can be so much better in this connection. When I was in college, I played music to play my way through college and pay my way through college. There was a lot of playing too. But as I was doing that, I encountered a singer-songwriter named Mark Gray, and he invited me to come to Nashville and write with him. Mark had written some big hits. No, he hadn't. He hadn't yet. He wrote them while I was with him, and I didn't get my name on them. He wrote "Take Me Down" for Alabama, and he wrote "The Closer You Get" for Alabama, and he had some big hits in the early 80s. So he invited me to come to Nashville and write with him because he heard me playing in a place in Shreveport. And I remember being kind of up there in that Nashville scene. I slept at a publishing house on Music Row. I was pretty broke because I was just finishing college. And the name of this place was, the publishing house is called Face the Music. It was named after the dog whose name was Face. And lots of big people came and went through those doors. And I remember sitting with Mark at the piano one time. We were trying to write a song, which back in those days could make you very rich and very famous if you could write one song, one hit song. And to write a hit song was to follow the formula. You had to do just the right kind of song. It had to have verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. Seems like we've done a couple of those today. And you had to have a hook. We would sit up for sometimes 48 hours at the piano trying to come up with the hook. And if we didn't find the hook after about 24 hours, we were down the street at Tree Publishing House or some other publishing house trying to find the hook. Because you had to have the hook. And even if you got 3 other guys' names on the song, you were going to have a hit better if you had the hook. So you might as well not waste the last 24 hours and find somebody else who could figure out the hook. And that's the way the Nashville songwriting scene worked. It was all about trying to write that hit. And yet what I found over and over again in that scene was, it's kind of like, it could be really fast and really rich. It was like donuts just out of the grease, covered with frosting, sweet, but pretty much empty calories. As Harry Chapin once said, through that period of the 80s, he said, I never could quite figure out how to fit in the music scene. It seemed like all about kind of look at your navel and say boogie and try to get some sense of meaning out of that. But I remember sitting at the piano at one point, and I said, Mark, how did you get into this? How did you get into this? And it turned out that Mark had been invited by somebody to play, and he at some point had ended up in one of the big studios, and there was this big grand piano, and he sat down at this piano that had been played by many, many of these famous people, and he sat down to play, and the song that came out as he began to write went something like this. He said, this old piano, it's made some people cry. It's made some good loves die. I reckon I know why. Because when he reached the top of the mountain, when he reached the end of the rainbow, there was no pot of gold. And when he reached the top of the mountain, he had no one to hold. I think about that from time to time. I think about the difference between this desperate sense of needing to be famous for some reason. For what? To have power and wealth for what? There's nothing wrong with power and wealth. But for what? Otherwise, it's just empty calories. However sweet. Every moment that we live is lived in some context. There's a lot of talk right now in the spiritual world and the communities that want to talk about living in the now, Eckhart Tolle, being in the now, be present, be here now. Being here now is always in some sense of context. We continually experience this moment with the meaning that we have built in our lives. What are you building? What are you growing? How are you experiencing each moment? How do you make meaning out of it? Whatever it is, whatever you rehearse is the meaning you experience in the moment. Whatever you do over and over again, we're ritualizing creatures. And two people can walk into the same place, into the same meadow, under the same sunshine or rain, and have entirely different meaning and experiences because of who they've been and what they've rehearsed in their own lives. Right? Maybe it's time for us to find ways to begin to rehearse a way of living that I think Jesus kind of understood. I think he understood it as we are all people on our way somewhere. I don't know where you come from, but you've been shaped by that. My job is not to judge that. Judge not, lest you be judged. And when harm happens somehow because of those differences between us, how many times should I forgive? So many. And maybe the more we live into this idea of unity of all of us, maybe that's something we could practice. What would it be like to look into someone else's eyes, even a stranger, even somebody that you've never met, and practice seeing them with a sense of we are actually connected. We are more connected than appearances might suggest. What happens to you does impact me, is important to me. Something about the way the early Christians who were following Jesus always struck me, because they would gather and they would hold these love feasts. Maybe it was kind of the early thing that became the Eucharist, the communion service, as the church began to create sacraments that could be repeated. But in the early days, imagine the followers of Jesus after his death gathering together, maybe not even knowing about the story of Jesus breaking the bread, maybe not even knowing about that story of him taking the cup. Maybe just knowing that there's something between us that has to be acknowledged and celebrated and rehearsed, so that the more we practice this understanding of living in this unity, maybe we begin to even see our enemies with love. Maybe even see through the veil of the polarization in our society. Maybe see those who have been trodden down as people who also deserve our love and support. Maybe practicing that and celebrating that is what they were doing with these early love feasts. So this morning, I want to invite you to share in a love feast. It's open to anybody. And I invite you to just, as you consider how you might want to participate in this, draw upon your own memories of what is true and loving in your heart. Maybe draw from your own experience of what the whole story of Jesus means to you, where it has touched your life, where his life still kind of lives on in you. Maybe it's just a memory of someone who loved you so well that you found a certain sense of freedom, of wholeness that you never quite knew until that moment. You know what I'm talking about? Someone who allowed you to be exactly who you were and loved you anyway. Do you have a memory about that? If you could bottle it and practice it every day, whatever that memory is, if you could live through that, always showing it, always trying to show it, how would the world be? What would change in your world if you could live that out, that moment that you felt so loved, that moment that you knew grace?